In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the work for a recent paper that we published in Natural Hazards and Earth System Science on a catastrophe risk model for flooding in the UK, and thanks to my co-authors here. This was work between a collaboration between University of Bristol and Fathom, our flood risk consultancy. Okay, so in terms of where we are with current UK flood risk estimates, there are basically three sources. We have the national flood risk assessments that are made by different nations in the UK. Those are then pulled together to perform something called the Climate Change Risk Assessment, which the UK government mandates is done every 5 years. And then we've got a whole bunch of different insurance industry catastrophe risk models. But if we have a think about all those different sources, we can say a number of things about them. And these are really important from a scientific point of view. The first is that they have limited or no method information about how these things were done. And also there's limited or no validation about the results that come out of them, and they're not peer-reviewed at all. The other source of data that we have are observed flood losses from the Association of British Insurers. And these guys have collated annual flood losses over the last 20 years and published those. And the interesting thing is, when we put all these numbers onto the same basis, and we compare the observed data from the ABI with the expected annual damage we get from the national flood risk assessments, the climate change risk assessment in the UK, we find that those national assessments are about a factor 3 too high. So we've known for some time from the work of Edmund Penning-Rousel starting back in 2015 that current UK flood risk estimates have got a significant high bias. So what do we do about that? Well, what we chose to do was to try and develop a new catastrophe model for UK flooding that's both fully transparent and validated. So it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, and we're clear about where it works and where it doesn't. And the method's quite complex, and in an 8-minute talk, I've not really got time to go through it in too much detail, but the methods are there in the paper. But just to direct your attention, there's kind of 4 components. First thing in green are the data inputs. So we take river flow, rainfall and tide gauge data from observing stations in the UK. We take data on the river network, the DM and flood defences, so geometric information. And then we take in the bottom right corner data on exposure from a building layer by Verisk and the standard UK depth damage curves, the vulnerability functions from what's known as the multicoloured manual. We then drop those into a standard hydraulic model. And for those people in the room, you'll be very familiar with these. It's a 2D finite difference solution of the local inertial form of the shallow water equations. And it's applied at 20 to 25 meter resolution, 1 arcsecond resolution over the UK. And from that, we get historical hazard maps. We then implement climate change projections from the UK CP18 climate projections. These are the most recent projections from the Met Office, and also some sea level rise projections from Kopp et al. And we use those to produce future hazard maps. And then lastly, there's the catastrophe model component. And here, instead of just simulating particular return period events, we use a statistical model, the Heffernan and Torn model, to develop realistic event footprints and come up with 10,000 years of realistic event footprints representing the climate of 2020. And that allows us to see far more in detail into the tails of the distribution. And then gives us our risk metrics. So to summarize the simulation, it's a 1 arcsecond resolution model of the whole UK, simulates fluvial, pluvial and coastal floods, mostly based on LiDAR terrain data, and it simulates 10 different return periods from pretty small up to very large indeed. We include flood defences. We simulate 10,000 years of stochastic flood events using the Met Office 12-kilometre regional climate model runs. And then finally, what we do is we compute monetary losses in the form of a loss exceedance curve for 5 specific global warming levels. So how does this validate? Well, the first thing we did is we compared the entire GB model against the UK government's maps of 1 in 100 year flood risk zones. And you can see in blue the outputs from our catastrophe model, and in red the equivalent government data for a bunch of different sites in the UK. And you can see that broadly we get a very good match between the CAT model we produced and the official government hazard maps. If we compute the performance statistics there, in terms of our standard things like hit rate, false alarm rate, and critical success index, we get rather, we get pretty decent results. Critical success index is probably the most powerful. And there, what we usually find is the numbers above 0.7 are really indicating a very good match between the two different patterns that you're trying to compare. Particularly in this case, where the government data are not truth, they're derived from a local model, which is assuming has higher skill, but might not necessarily be the case. And that might particularly not be the case in coastal areas. And this is represented by panel B1 and B2 in these plots on the right. We know in coastal areas that UK government flood hazard maps are produced by bathtub models, which tend to significantly overpredict the area at risk from inundation. These just project the extreme water level at the coast inland until anything under that level is regarded as being flooded, irrespective of whether water could actually propagate to that point during an event or not. And as you can see for this area around the Wash in eastern UK, government maps indicate much more flooding than the hydrodynamic model that we ran. And it leads me to suspect that actually in some coastal areas, the hydrodynamic modelling in our catastrophe model might be a bit better than the government maps themselves. We've also compared and model water levels for specific events, particularly this event from 2005 in Carlisle, where we actually went out, the University of Bristol went out along with the Environment Agency and surveyed rack and watermarks of maximum water levels post the event. And those observed data are probably about 10 centimetre accurate on average, but individual points might have much higher error than that. We compared the CAP model to the independent observed data and also the output from a local hydraulic model built at 5-metre resolution with LiDAR terrain data and observed ground measured flows. The local model has got a much sharper peak, but the RMSE is not too different. It's 41 centimetres in the national CAP model, but we can only get a model of 36 centimetre accurate when we've got all the local information in there. So we think the CAP model in certain places such as this can do almost as well as local modelling can during events. So here are the expected annual damage estimates. You'll remember that the observed EAD from the Association of British Insurers was 714 million. And the modelled EAD is extremely close to that at 730, but that is somewhat fortuitous, and perhaps the best thing to do is look at the spread. So the green histogram here is the spread of expected annual damages that we get from 10,000 random samples of CAP model 20-year time periods. We do that because the ABI data is also for a 20-year time period. And because of natural climate variability, we could get quite different observed data just on the random flood events that could occur in any 20-year period. So the green histogram gives some idea of the natural flood climate variability. But you can see that the average ABI data from 98 to 2018 sits squarely within the middle of our modelled estimates, and actually the average of the centre point of our distribution is pretty close as well. Interestingly, the National Flood Risk Assessments and the UK Climate Change Risk Assessments lie well outside our model distribution, confirming the ideas of Edmund Penning-Rousell about the fact that these are likely to be extreme overestimates of the expected annual damage. So these are the loss exceedance curves under climate change. We've computed these for 5 different global warming levels since pre-industrial. 0.6 of a degree is about the position we faced in 1990. And by 2020, we're up to about 1.1 degrees of warming. You can see from these two curves that actually the change between 1990 and 2020 conditions is actually rather small. And if we manage to, the whole world manages to implement its COP26 and net zero pledges, actually the loss exceedance curve in the UK increases, but not that much. It's only really at the upper end of the loss exceedance curve. Return periods up to over about 70 years and out and beyond, that we start to see a bit of a divergence between future conditions and what we're experiencing at present. However, if the world doesn't meet its only meets its COP26 pledges and the net zero ambitions are not implemented, we could see as much as 2.5 degrees warming as a global average above pre-industrial. And in that case, the loss exceedance curve for flood in the UK jumps quite a bit. And further, if we get to 3.3 degrees, a situation where our carbon reduction targets are missed, we have high climate sensitivity, we do see losses due to flooding in the UK jumping quite substantially. Here's those data in tabular form. You can see that if we look at the expected annual damage, the percentage changes above 1990 levels, it's really only a very small 1.5% increase that we see for expected annual damage changes between 1990 and 2020. And if we meet the COP26 and net zero commitments across the planet, then actually expected annual damages in the UK, we predict, go up by only 3 or 4%. If we don't do that, then rises of 10% or 20%, in a 20%, 23% in a plausible worst case scenario are possible. The numbers are higher for 1 in 100-year losses, and here the percentage change to date has been around about 6% above 1990 levels, but we can keep it to around about 8% if all the carbon reduction pledges are followed. 37%, however, is going to be much more tricky for the UK to manage its way out of, and it is rather to be avoided. Now, those are national averages, and it's worth saying that even if we keep expected annual damage change with 1.8 degrees of warming to 4% as a change in national averages, that conceals an awful lot of spatial variability across the country. The left-hand panel, you can see the variability in the historic expected annual damage, and you can see that it peaks around the major population centres in London, the southeast, South Wales, and the conurbations of the northwest England and across the central belt in Scotland. And this is, on the right-hand panel, you see the change in percentage terms in EAD with 1.8 degrees of warming. So this is a situation where not the average across the UK is not changing that much, but actually it's being, the losses or the risks are being redistributed quite markedly. Areas of South Wales, northwest England, the central belt of Scotland see increases of more than 10% and perhaps even over 25%. Whereas actually there's a large swathe of central and southwest and northeast England where actually the change in risk is pretty flat, and it might even be marginally going down at some points. So to summarise, this is the first complete high-resolution analysis of UK flood risk from all sources. There's a climate change analysis accounting for sea level, precipitation patterns and river discharge change, and we perform it in validation similar to many local custom-built 2D models. EAD out of this is 730 million for the UK, and it compares favourably with observations from the Association of British Insurers. And actually, it shows that what Edmund Penning-Razol has already stated, the previous UK flood loss estimates based on government data are biased high, and they lie well outside our model loss distribution, which is plausibly centred on the observations. With 1% annual flood losses are 6% greater in an average to 2020, with 1.1 degrees of warming compared to 1990. But we do, the UK requires that all countries implement their COP26 pledges and net zero ambitions to keep UK flood risk increases due to climate change down to manageable levels. And if you want any more details, here's the reference for the paper that we published at the bottom of the slide. Thanks very much.